I don't remember you, she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. But the way his hand tightened around the folder said he had been waiting years to hear anything but that. The rain had started an hour ago, thin at first, now steady against the wide glass panels of Mercy General Hospital, tracing crooked paths down the surface like memories that refused to stay buried, and Emily Carter stood just outside the sliding doors, her coat too light for the cold, her sneakers damp, clutching her 5-year-old son against her side as if warmth alone could keep his fever down. Her fingers trembling not from the weather but from the quiet panic she refused to let reach her eyes, because panic didn't pay bills and it didn't get doctors to say yes. Inside, the lobby glowed sterile white, polished floors reflecting people who moved with purpose, nurses in soft blue scrubs, visitors holding coffee cups and conversations, lives that seemed uninterrupted, untouched, and for a moment she just watched them, like someone standing outside a life she almost recognized but couldn't step back into. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," the receptionist had said minutes earlier, her voice practiced, not unkind but immovable. "Without insurance or a deposit, we can't admit him tonight." And Emily had nodded like she understood, like this was reasonable, like her son's quiet whimper didn't slice through her chest with every breath he took, and now she stood there, unsure whether to walk away or collapse, because both felt equally impossible. She shifted her weight, pressing her cheek briefly to her son's hair, breathing in the faint scent of baby shampoo and something else, fear, maybe, or exhaustion, and closed her eyes for half a second too long, long enough to miss the moment the black sedan pulled up to the curb, long enough to miss the man who stepped out and paused as if the world had tilted just slightly off balance. Daniel Hayes didn't usually stop for anything. His days were measured in meetings, decisions, numbers that carried more weight than most people's entire lives, and yet something about the image in front of him, her standing there, soaked at the edges, holding on to something small and fragile, caught him in a way he couldn't explain, like a memory brushing past his mind without permission, familiar but unreachable. He watched as she turned slightly, revealing a face lined with fatigue but steady, determined in a quiet way that didn't ask for attention. And there it was again, that strange pull, as if he had seen her before, not in a photograph or a meeting, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that refused to come into focus. The security guard near the entrance glanced at Daniel, recognition flashing instantly, posture straightening, but Daniel barely acknowledged him as he stepped closer, his gaze fixed, not intrusive, just searching, like he was trying to solve something without knowing the question. Emily felt it before she saw him, that shift in presence, subtle but undeniable, and when she looked up, her first instinct wasn't recognition, it was caution, because men in tailored coats and polished shoes didn't stop for women like her unless there was a reason, and reasons usually came with expectations she couldn't afford. "Is he okay?" Daniel asked, his voice calm, controlled, but softer than the environment around them, and she hesitated, just a fraction, weighing pride against urgency, before answering. "He has a fever. They won't take us." She said it simply, without pleading, without embellishment, and something in that restraint hit him harder than any desperation could have, because it wasn't resignation, it was endurance. For a moment neither of them moved, the rain filling the silence between them, until Daniel reached into his coat, not hurried, not dramatic, just certain, and said, "Come inside. I'll handle it." Emily blinked, confusion flickering across her face, because help like that didn't come without explanation, and yet something in his tone, steady, unshaken, made it feel less like an offer and more like a decision already made. "Why would you?" she started, but the words didn't finish, because he was already turning toward the doors, expecting her to follow, and against every instinct that told her to stay guarded, she did, stepping into the bright lobby beside a man who felt strangely familiar and completely unknown at the same time, unaware that this moment, quiet and unremarkable to everyone else, had already begun unraveling a past she claimed she didn't remember, and a truth he was no longer willing to ignore. The sliding doors parted with a soft mechanical sigh, and the warmth inside wrapped around Emily like something she had not felt in weeks, but it did not ease the tension in her shoulders as she followed just a step behind him, careful, alert, her son still pressed close to her chest as if letting go for even a second might change everything, and Daniel moved through the lobby with quiet authority, not raising his voice, not asking for attention. Yet people noticed a subtle shift in posture. From the staff at the front desk, a glance from a nurse who recognized him without needing confirmation, and when he stopped at the counter, the same receptionist who had turned Emily away straightened instantly, her tone softening before he even spoke. "I need a pediatric evaluation," Daniel said, his voice even, controlled, as if this was simply another decision among many. "Admit him and run whatever tests are necessary." The receptionist hesitated for half a second, just long enough to glance at Emily, at her worn coat and damp shoes, at the quiet contrast between them, before looking back at Daniel. "Of course, sir," she replied, already reaching for forms, her earlier refusal dissolving into efficiency, and Emily felt something twist in her chest, not relief exactly, not yet, but the strange realization that the same situation could be seen differently depending on who stood beside you. A nurse appeared within moments, guiding them down a hallway washed in soft white light, the air carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and something cleaner than anything Emily had known lately, and as they walked, her son stirred slightly, a small sound escaping him, fragile but alive, and she tightened her hold instinctively, whispering under her breath, "It is okay, sweetheart, we are here now," even though she was not sure what "here" would mean once this moment passed. Daniel walked beside her, not too close, not distant either, his presence steady, almost deliberate, as if he was measuring something invisible, and once, just once, his gaze flickered toward the child, then back to Emily, like he was searching for a connection that refused to reveal itself fully. They reached a small examination room, simple but bright, and the nurse gently guided Emily to sit, her movements practiced, reassuring without being overly familiar, and within minutes, the process began, temperature taken, pulse checked, questions asked in a calm voice that did not judge, and Emily answered each one carefully, her voice low but clear. As if she had learned long ago that being composed was the only way to be taken seriously. Daniel remained by the door, hands loosely at his sides, watching without interruption, but his eyes never left them, and when the doctor entered, a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and a steady presence, he paused when he saw Daniel, recognition immediate but subtle, like an understanding shared without words. "Mr. Hayes?" the doctor said quietly, then shifted his attention back to the child, professional focus taking over, and as he began his examination, the room settled into a rhythm of quiet care, the kind that did not promise miracles but offered something close to hope. Emily exhaled slowly for the first time since stepping inside, her fingers brushing lightly against her son's forehead, feeling the warmth there, the reason she had pushed past everything else, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this would be enough, that maybe tonight would not end the way she had feared. When the doctor stepped back, offering a reassuring nod and explaining that they would run a few tests but expected the fever to be manageable, Emily's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension easing in increments, and she turned toward Daniel, her eyes meeting his with something softer now, something uncertain but genuine. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than she could explain, and he held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if there was something else he wanted to say but could not quite reach it. "It is nothing," he replied, though the way his voice lowered suggested it was not that simple, and as he shifted his attention briefly to the chart at the foot of the bed, his expression changed, just slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features, as if a detail had caught his attention, something small but significant, something that did not belong to this moment alone, and Emily, still unaware, adjusted the blanket around her son, not realizing that whatever had drawn him to her in the rain had not been coincidence, and whatever he had just noticed was about to make it impossible for him to walk away. Daniel did not move immediately, but his eyes remained fixed on the chart at the foot of the bed, scanning the printed lines with the precision that came from years of making decisions where details mattered, and yet this was different, because the numbers and dates in front of him did not just represent medical data, they stirred something deeper, something unsettled, and he reached out slowly, almost unconsciously. lifting the chart just enough to read more clearly, his expression tightening for the briefest moment before smoothing out again, as if he had trained himself not to react too quickly. Emily noticed the shift, subtle but present, and instinctively straightened, her hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder as she watched him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes, because people like him did not linger over details unless those details meant something, and she could not shake the feeling that whatever he was seeing had somehow involved her. "Is there something wrong?" she asked carefully, her voice steady but edged with concern, and Daniel glanced up, meeting her gaze for a second before looking back down, choosing his words with deliberate care. "How old is he?" he asked instead, his tone neutral, but the question carried a weight that felt heavier than it should have. 5. Emily replied without hesitation, brushing a strand of hair away from her son's forehead. "He just turned 5 last month." And Daniel nodded slowly, his thumb resting against the edge of the paper as if anchoring himself to something concrete, but his mind was already moving, calculating, aligning pieces. That did not quite fit but refused to be ignored. The date on the chart lingered in his thoughts, a quiet echo that pulled him backward to a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit, a period marked by blurred memories and unanswered questions, a gap that had always felt incomplete no matter how much he tried to move forward, and now, standing in this small hospital room, that gap seemed to press closer, as if demanding to be acknowledged. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, her discomfort growing, not because of anything he had said, but because of what he had not said, the silence stretching between them in a way that made her feel exposed, like she was standing at the edge of something she could not see. "Thank you for helping us," she said again, softer this time, as if reminding both of them why he was there, why this moment should remain simple, and Daniel lowered the chart, placing it back where he had found it, but his attention did not leave her. "You said earlier," he began, his voice quieter now, more measured, "that you do not remember your past." And she stiffened slightly, the words landing heavier than she expected, because that part of her life was not something she shared easily, not something she understood herself. "I remember some things," she clarified, her gaze dropping briefly before returning to his. "Just not before a certain point." And for a moment, something like hesitation crossed his face, rare and fleeting, before he nodded, as if accepting her answer while simultaneously questioning it. The monitor beside the bed beeped softly, steady and reassuring, grounding the room in something real, something present, but Daniel's thoughts were already moving beyond it, connecting fragments that had remained separate until now, and he took a step back, creating a small distance between them, not out of detachment, but out of necessity, as if he needed space to think, to understand what this meant. "Get some rest," he said finally, his tone returning to its earlier calm, controlled state, but there was an undercurrent now, something unresolved. "It will take care of him." And Emily nodded, though her eyes lingered on him a moment longer. Searching for clarity she did not receive, and as he turned toward the door, his hand paused briefly on the handle, his reflection faintly visible in the glass panel beside it, a man who had built his life on certainty now facing something that refused to fit into any clear answer. Outside the room, the hallway stretched long and quiet, the muted sounds of the hospital continuing as if nothing had changed, but for Daniel, something had shifted, something that would not allow him to walk away without knowing more, and as he moved down the corridor, already reaching for his phone, one thought repeated itself with increasing clarity, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent enough to demand action. Because coincidences did not align this precisely, not without reason, and whatever that reason was, it was no longer something he could ignore. The hallway felt colder than the room he had just left, not in temperature but in the way silence settled into the space between footsteps, and Daniel walked with measured pace, his mind no longer anchored to the present moment but pulled backward into fragments he had spent years ignoring, pieces that had never fully made sense until now, and when he reached the end of the corridor, he stopped beneath a dim overhead light, pulling his phone from his coat pocket with a precision that mirrored the shift in his thoughts. He did not hesitate as he scrolled through his contacts, selecting a number that few people had, his thumb pressing call as his gaze fixed on the reflective surface of the polished floor, seeing not just his own outline but the faint distortion of a past he had never fully understood. The line connected almost instantly. "I need you to look into something," he said without preamble, his voice low but firm, the kind that did not require repetition, and on the other end, a brief pause signaled attention, readiness. "5 years ago," Daniel continued, choosing each word carefully. "Late October, a hospital incident. Any reports involving unidentified patients or memory loss cases within a 50-mile radius?" And as he spoke, his eyes lifted slightly, focusing on nothing and everything at once, because this was no longer a passing curiosity, it was a pattern forming in real time. "I want names, records, anything that connects," he added, then ended the call without waiting for confirmation, because he already knew it would be done. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, exhaling slowly, but the tension did not leave him, it only shifted, settling deeper, more focused. Meanwhile, inside the room, Emily sat quietly beside the bed, her fingers tracing slow circles on her son's arm, grounding herself in the rhythm of his breathing, the steady rise and fall that reassured her more than any words could, and yet her thoughts drifted back to the man who had just left, to the way he had looked at the chart, to the question he had asked, simple on the surface but heavy with something she could not define. She had grown used to people asking questions, to curiosity that never led anywhere meaningful, but this had felt different, like he already knew something she did not, and that unsettled her in a way she could not explain. She shifted slightly in the chair, her eyes moving to the small plastic bracelet around her son's wrist, the hospital identification band that seemed too large for him, and for a moment, a flicker of something crossed her mind, not a memory exactly, but a sensation, brief and fleeting, like standing in a place she had once known but could not fully recognize, and she blinked, the feeling gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only the quiet hum of the room behind. Across the building, Daniel stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft mechanical sound that echoed louder than it should have, and as the numbers above the panel began to descend, he leaned back slightly, his reflection appearing again in the mirrored wall, sharper this time, more defined, but his expression was anything but clear. The date on the chart replayed in his mind, over and over, aligning with a gap he had never been able to fill, a night that had ended in silence, in absence, in a missing piece no investigation had ever fully explained, and now, standing between floors, he felt that gap narrowing, not with answers yet, but with the certainty that answers existed. The elevator doors opened into the lobby, the sound of rain still faintly audible through the glass, and he stepped out without slowing, his direction clear even if the path ahead was not, because whatever connection had brought him to that moment, it was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. Back in the room, Emily leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against her son's hand, her eyes closing for just a second, and in that brief moment of stillness, another flicker passed through her mind, this one sharper, more defined, a sterile room, a voice calling out, a sense of urgency she could not place, and her eyes snapped open, her breath catching slightly as she looked around, disoriented, as if the walls themselves had shifted. She shook her head, dismissing it as exhaustion, as stress, as anything but what it might truly be, because she had learned not to trust those fragments, not to chase them, not when they never led anywhere real. But somewhere else in the building, a man was already following the trail she had spent years trying to leave behind, and for the first time, the distance between what she remembered and what actually happened was beginning to close, whether she was ready for it or not. The night deepened outside the hospital windows, the rain softening into a quiet drizzle that tapped gently against the glass, and inside the small room, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor became the only constant Emily allowed herself to trust, her fingers still resting lightly on her son's arm as if that connection alone could keep everything else from unraveling, but her thoughts refused to stay still, circling back again and again to the man who had walked in like a stranger and left, like someone who knew more than he should. She shifted in the chair, exhaustion settling into her bones, but beneath it was something sharper now, something restless, because the question he had asked lingered in her mind in a way that felt too precise to ignore, and she found herself replaying his expression, the subtle change when he looked at the chart, the way his voice had lowered when he mentioned her memory, as if he had already stepped into a story she had never been able to finish. She looked down at her son, brushing her thumb gently across his small hand, grounding herself in something real, something present, but even that felt slightly distant now, like she was holding on to a moment, while something unseen shifted just beyond her reach. Across the city, Daniel sat in the back of his car, the interior dim and quiet, the city lights passing in blurred streaks through the tinted window, but he barely noticed them, his attention fixed on the tablet in his hand, waiting, because he knew the response would come quickly, and when it did, it arrived not as a single answer, but as a series of fragments that began to form something far more complicated than he had anticipated. The screen lit up with a secure message, a list of files, timestamps, hospital codes, and one line that immediately caught his attention, marked in a way that suggested it had once been overlooked but never erased, and he tapped it open, his eyes scanning rapidly, absorbing each detail with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life. But this was different, because the information did not just inform, it unsettled. Unidentified female patient. The report began, dated almost exactly 5 years earlier, admitted under emergency circumstances, no identification, no immediate family contact, and then another line, quieter but more significant. Temporary memory impairment observed. And Daniel's grip on the tablet tightened slightly, the words pulling at something buried deep beneath years of controlled distance. He scrolled further, his expression sharpening, and then he saw it, a note added later, almost like an afterthought. Patient discharged with child. And for a moment, everything stilled, the movement of the car, the distant sound of traffic, even his own breathing, because the alignment was too precise, too exact to dismiss. He leaned back slowly, the weight of the realization settling in, not fully formed yet, but undeniable, and his mind moved quickly, connecting timelines, calculating ages, tracing possibilities that had once seemed impossible but now felt disturbingly real. Back in the hospital room, Emily adjusted the blanket around her son, her movements automatic, practiced, but her thoughts were elsewhere, drifting towards something she could not quite grasp, and as she leaned back in the chair, her gaze fell on the small metal tray beside the bed, the reflection faint but clear enough to catch her own face, tired, familiar, and yet for a split second, something felt off. Like she was looking at a version of herself that was missing something essential, something she had lost but never truly understood. Her brow furrowed slightly, and then it came again, not a full memory, not even a clear image, just a flash, a sterile hallway, the echo of footsteps, a voice calling out a name she could not hear clearly, and she inhaled sharply, her hand tightening around the edge of the chair as the sensation passed, leaving behind a quiet unease that refused to settle. She closed her eyes briefly, forcing herself to breathe, to focus, to return to what she knew, because chasing fragments had never brought her anything but frustration, but somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought began to take shape, small but persistent, that maybe those fragments were not random, maybe they were pieces of something waiting to be understood. In the car, Daniel looked out at the city, the reflection of the screen still faintly visible in the glass, and for the first time in years, certainty felt out of reach, replaced by something far more complex, because if the information in front of him was true, then the woman sitting in that hospital room was not just someone he had helped, she was someone connected to a moment he had never been able to explain. A moment that had shaped more of his life than he had ever admitted, and as the car slowed at a red light, he made a decision, quiet but absolute, because answers were no longer optional, they were necessary, and whatever truth lay between the lines of those records, he was going to uncover it, no matter how far back it reached or how much it changed everything he thought he knew. Morning arrived quietly, not with sunlight but with a gradual shift in the tone of the room, the soft gray outside the window replacing the deep blue of night, and Emily stirred in the chair, her body stiff from hours of half-sleep, her hand still resting where it had been all night, as if she had not allowed herself to fully let go even for a moment. And when she opened her eyes, the first thing she did was look at her son, checking the steady rhythm of his breathing before anything else, grounding herself again in the one certainty she trusted. The fever had eased slightly, the tension in his small face softer now, and she exhaled slowly, a quiet release she did not realize she had been holding, But even as relief settled in, it was quickly followed by that same lingering unease, the feeling that something beyond this room was already in motion. A soft knock came at the door, gentle but deliberate, and before she could respond, it opened just enough for a nurse to step in, her expression warm, reassuring, but with a hint of curiosity behind it. "Good morning," she said softly, moving toward the bed to check the monitors, her movements practiced and efficient, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Emily in a way that felt almost knowing. "He is responding well. The doctor will be in shortly," she added, adjusting the blanket with care, and Emily nodded, offering a small, grateful smile, but she hesitated for a second before asking, "The man who brought us in last night, is he still here?" The nurse paused, just slightly, then gave a polite shake of her head. "Mr. Hayes left earlier, but he made sure everything here is taken care of," she replied, her tone neutral, but the weight of the name lingered in the air longer than expected, and Emily lowered her gaze, repeating it silently in her mind, as if saying it again might make it feel less unfamiliar. Daniel Hayes. It sounded like someone she should recognize, someone important, but her mind offered nothing in return, only that same frustrating emptiness where answers should have been. Across the city, Daniel stood in his office, the early morning light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, but he barely noticed the view, his attention fixed on the documents spread across his desk, each one a piece of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape whether he was ready for it or not. He had not slept, not even for a moment, because every new detail had only led to more questions, and now, as he read through the compiled records again, slower this time, more deliberate, the connections felt impossible to ignore. The unidentified patient. The memory loss. The child discharged with her. The timeline that aligned too precisely with a period he had never been able to explain. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk, his reflection faintly visible in the glass surface, and for the first time, the possibility formed clearly in his mind, not as a theory, but as something closer to truth, something that demanded confirmation. He reached for another file, this one older, one he had not opened in years, and as he flipped it open, the past came back not in clear images, but in sensations, a night blurred by confusion, a hospital room, a voice he could not place but had never completely forgotten, and he closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself, because if what he was beginning to suspect was real, then everything about that night had been more significant than he had ever allowed himself to believe. Back in the hospital, Emily stood near the window now, watching the light shift across the city, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, as if holding something in place, and her thoughts drifted again, not to the fear of the night before, but to the quiet, persistent feeling that something was missing, something just out of reach, and she pressed her fingers lightly against her temple, willing the fragments to come together. But they remained scattered, incomplete. She turned back toward the bed, her focus returning to what mattered most, but as she did, her gaze caught on the small table beside it, where a neatly folded document had been placed, something she did not remember being there before, and she stepped closer, hesitation slowing her movement as she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, and for a moment, she simply stared at it. A strange sense of recognition settling in without explanation. Somewhere else in the city, Daniel was already moving. Already stepping into a truth that had waited 5 years to be uncovered, and back in that quiet hospital room, Emily stood on the edge of the same truth without even realizing it, her hand resting on something that might finally begin to answer the question she had been asking without words for years. Because sometimes the past does not return all at once, sometimes it waits, patiently. For the moment you are no longer able to look away. Emily hesitated for a long moment before unfolding the document, her fingers moving slower than necessary as if some part of her already understood that once she looked at it, something would change, something she could not easily put back into place, and the quiet hum of the hospital room seemed to fade into the background as the paper opened fully in her hands, revealing clean printed lines, official formatting. And at the top, a heading that made her breath catch just slightly. Hospital Discharge Summary. The words felt heavier than they should have, not unfamiliar, but not fully recognized either, and her eyes moved down the page carefully, scanning each line as if reading someone else's story, someone else's life, until they stopped abruptly on a name. Emily Carter. She blinked once, then again, her grip tightening around the edges of the paper as if the letters might shift if she looked long enough, but they remained steady, undeniable, and beneath her name, more information followed, clinical, precise, detached in the way medical language always was, but there was one line that pulled everything else into focus. Patient admitted under emergency conditions. Temporary memory impairment observed. Her heartbeat quickened, not dramatically, but enough that she became aware of it, the steady rhythm now slightly uneven as something deep inside her responded to the words before her mind could fully process them, and she swallowed, her gaze continuing downward, searching, needing to understand what she was looking at even as a part of her resisted it. Then she saw the date. 5 years ago. The room seemed to narrow slightly, not physically, but in the way her awareness shifted, everything outside the document fading as that single detail anchored her attention, because 5 years ago was not just a time, it was a boundary, the point where her memory stopped, where everything before had dissolved into fragments she had never been able to piece together, and now that boundary was no longer empty, it was filled with something real, something recorded, something she could not dismiss. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page, her breath shallow, controlled, and then she found it again, another line, quieter, but somehow more significant than everything else. Patient discharged with child. For a moment, she did not understand what she was reading, not fully, because the words existed but refused to connect, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, her mind began to align them, to place them beside each other in a way that made sense, and when it did, the realization was not loud or overwhelming, it was quiet, heavy, like a weight settling into place where it had always belonged. She looked up instinctively, her gaze moving to the bed where her son lay sleeping, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and something inside her shifted, something deeper than thought, deeper than memory, a recognition that did not come from knowing but from feeling, and she stepped closer, the paper still in her hand, her eyes searching his face as if seeing him for the first time and yet somehow more clearly than ever before. A soft sound escaped her, barely audible, not quite a word, and she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his hair, grounding herself in the reality in front of her, because if what she was holding was true, then her life had not started 5 years ago the way she had always believed, it had continued from something she had lost, something that now refused to remain hidden. Across the city, Daniel stood in front of a large window, the skyline stretching out before him, but his focus was inward, his thoughts aligning with a clarity that had been missing for years, and the more he reviewed the information, the more certain he became that this was not coincidence, not chance, but a connection that had been there all along, waiting to be uncovered. He picked up another document, one that had been buried in his own records, something he had once dismissed as incomplete, and as he read it again, the details mirrored what he had just discovered, the same time frame, the same unexplained gap, and a note that had once seemed insignificant now stood out with new meaning. Unknown female assisted during critical condition. He closed the file slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were forming a picture, one that pointed in a direction he could no longer ignore. Back in the hospital room, Emily lowered herself into the chair again, the document resting loosely in her lap, her mind racing through possibilities she could not fully grasp, and yet beneath the confusion, beneath the uncertainty, there was something else, something steady, something undeniable, a quiet truth beginning to surface, not as a memory yet, but as a certainty that what she had lost was not gone forever. It was simply waiting, and now, for the first time, it had a way back. Emily did not realize how long she had been sitting there until the sound of a door opening gently pulled her back to the present, the paper still resting in her lap, her fingers loosely holding its edges as if she had forgotten it was even there, and when she looked up, the doctor stood quietly near the entrance, his expression calm but observant, as though he had already noticed the shift in the room. The subtle change that came when something unseen became real. "Ms. Carter," he said softly, stepping closer, his tone professional but not distant. "Your son is doing better." His fever is responding to treatment, and we expect a full recovery within the next day or two. And Emily nodded automatically, the words reaching her but not fully settling, because her thoughts were still anchored to the document, to the date, to the realization that her life had not begun where she had always believed it did. The doctor's gaze flicked briefly to the paper in her lap, then back to her face, and he paused for a moment before speaking again, his voice lowering slightly. That record, he added carefully. It was placed there this morning at Mr. Hayes's request. And something in Emily's chest tightened at the mention of his name, not fear, not exactly, but something closer to anticipation, as if she had been pulled into a story that was already unfolding without her understanding it. Why would he do that? She asked quietly, her voice steady but edged with something deeper, and the doctor hesitated just enough to suggest there was more to the answer than he could fully explain. He has been asking questions, he replied, choosing his words with care. About cases from that time, about patients who might have been overlooked. And Emily swallowed, her eyes dropping briefly to the document again, the lines now feeling less like information and more like evidence of something she could no longer ignore. I do not remember any of this, she said, almost to herself, the words soft but firm, as if repeating them might restore some sense of control, and the doctor nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Memory does not always return the way we expect, he said, his tone gentle. Sometimes it begins with recognition before it becomes recollection. And Emily looked up at him, the distinction settling in her mind, because recognition was exactly what she had felt, not knowledge, not clarity, but something deeper, something instinctive that did not require explanation. The doctor offered a small, reassuring nod before stepping back, leaving her alone again with her thoughts, and for a moment, the room felt too quiet, the steady beeping of the monitor the only sound grounding her in the present. She looked down at her son once more, watching the peaceful rise and fall of his breathing, and then her gaze shifted back to the paper, her fingers tightening slightly as she lifted it again, reading the lines once more, slower this time, as if searching for something she had missed, something that might explain not just what happened, but why it had been hidden from her for so long. Across the city, Daniel stood in a private conference room, the documents now organized neatly in front of him, each one a step closer to the truth he had spent years unknowingly avoiding, and as he reviewed them again, a pattern emerged, clearer now, undeniable, the timeline aligning with precision, the details reinforcing each other until there was no room left for doubt. He reached for one final file, one that had arrived only moments earlier, and as he opened it, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the weight of what he was reading, because this was not just confirmation, it was clarity. The report detailed an incident, a medical emergency that had left him disoriented, his memory fractured, and in the margins, a note, brief but significant, identified the presence of an unidentified woman who had stayed, who had ensured he received care, who had not left until he was stable, and Daniel's hand stilled as he read it, because for the first time, the unknown was no longer abstract, it had a name. A face, a connection that extended beyond coincidence into something far more personal. He closed the file slowly, his gaze lifting to the glass wall in front of him, his reflections steady but his thoughts anything but, and in that moment, the distance between past and present collapsed into something immediate, something that demanded action. Back in the hospital room, Emily stood now, the paper still in her hand, her heart steady but her mind no longer able to remain still, because the pieces were no longer separate, they were beginning to form something she could feel even if she could not yet fully understand, and somewhere beyond that room, someone else had already reached the same conclusion, someone who was no longer content to leave the past where it was. And as the realization settled quietly between them, unseen but undeniable, the truth that had waited 5 years was finally beginning to surface, not as a memory yet, but as something even stronger, something that could not be forgotten again. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the hospital room, turning from pale gray to a softer gold that stretched across the floor and climbed halfway up the wall, and Emily stood near the window, the document still in her hand, no longer trembling but no longer distant either, as if it had settled into her reality in a way she could not undo, and for the first time since reading it, she did not feel overwhelmed, she felt focused, like something inside her had quietly decided that uncertainty was no longer an option. She turned back toward the bed, watching her son sleep, his face calmer now, the tension gone, and she realized that whatever truth was waiting for her, it was not something she could avoid, not anymore, not when it might explain not only who she had been, but why she had been given this life, this child, this second beginning she had never questioned until now. The door opened again, but this time she did not startle, she simply looked up, and when she saw him standing there, everything seemed to pause in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the moment had been waiting to happen exactly like this. Daniel Hayes stepped inside without rushing, his presence steady, controlled, but there was something different now, something less distant, less guarded, and for a brief second either of them spoke, the silence between them filled with everything that had already been discovered but not yet said. Emily held his gaze, her expression calm but searching, because she knew now that he had not helped her by accident, that there was something more behind his actions, something that connected them in a way she was only beginning to understand. "You left this," she said finally, lifting the document slightly, her voice even, not accusatory, but not uncertain either, and Daniel nodded once, his eyes not leaving hers. "Yes," he replied simply, and then he stepped closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough to make the conversation feel unavoidable. "You deserve to know," he added, his tone quieter now, but carrying a weight that made the words settle deeply. Emily looked down at the paper briefly, then back at him, and there was a shift in her expression, something firmer, more grounded, as if she had already accepted that whatever came next would not change her willingness to face it. "I remember nothing before that date," she said, her voice steady, but softer now, more personal. "But this says I was there, that I had him already, that I—" She paused, her gaze flickering toward her son for a moment before returning to Daniel. "That I lived a life I do not remember." And Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression focused, not detached, not distant, but present in a way that suggested he was no longer just observing the situation, he was part of it. "You did," he said after a moment, and there was no hesitation in his voice, only certainty, and that certainty made her heart tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen in a way she had not expected. "And you were not alone," he continued, his words measured, deliberate, as if he was revealing something that mattered more than anything else he had said so far, and Emily's brow furrowed slightly, her attention sharpening, because there was something in his tone that told her this was the part that would change everything. "5 years ago," he said, his gaze steady, "there was an incident. I was in the hospital. I do not remember everything clearly, but I know this." He paused briefly, not for effect, but because the truth itself required space. "Someone stayed. Someone made sure I was treated, that I did not get overlooked, that I made it through that night." And Emily's breath caught slightly, not because she understood fully, but because something inside her responded to the words before her mind could process them. "They never identified her," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. "But the timeline, the records, they all point to one person." And he stopped there, not needing to say her name, because the connection had already formed, already settled between them in a way that did not require confirmation. Emily stood still, the paper in her hand now feeling heavier than before, not as a document, but as a bridge between two lives, two versions of herself that had never met until now, and she shook her head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief, because the idea that she had been there, that she had been part of something so significant and never known it, felt impossible and undeniable at the same time. "I do not remember you," she said again, softer this time, not as a statement, but as something closer to an apology, and Daniel's expression shifted, just slightly, something gentler, something that held no frustration, only understanding. "I know," he replied, and there was no expectation in his voice, no demand for recognition, only a quiet acceptance of where they stood. The room fell silent again, but it was no longer empty, it was filled with something new, something fragile but real, the beginning of a truth either of them had planned to face. And as Emily looked at him, really looked this time, not as a stranger but as someone connected to a part of her life she had lost. She felt it again, that faint, fleeting sense of recognition, not a memory yet, but something just beneath the surface, waiting. And for the first time, she did not push it away. The silence in the room did not feel empty anymore, it felt charged, like something unseen had finally found its place between them, and Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the document as if holding onto it could steady the thoughts moving too quickly beneath the surface. Because what he had just said did not feel like a possibility, it felt like something already decided. Something waiting for her to catch up to. She walked slowly toward the window, needing space, not from him, but from the weight of what was beginning to settle in her mind, and the city outside moved as it always did, cars passing, people crossing streets, a world that continued without pause, unaware that inside this small hospital room, 2 lives were being quietly rearranged. "If I was there," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "If I helped you, then why do I not remember anything about it?" And the question was not defensive, it was searching, like someone trying to understand the shape of something they could feel but not see. Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not have a response, but because he understood that the answer was not simple, and he took a step closer, his posture relaxed but intentional, as if every movement was chosen with care. "The records say your memory was affected," he replied, his voice even, grounded. "Temporary, they wrote, but sometimes temporary does not mean what people expect it to mean." And Emily let out a slow breath, her eyes closing briefly as she absorbed that, because she had always accepted her memory loss as a fact without questioning its origin, without wondering if there had been more behind it than she had been told. She turned back toward him, her expression no longer uncertain, but focused, like someone beginning to piece together something important. "And my son," she said quietly, her eyes shifting toward the bed. "The record says I left with him, but I do not remember having him before that." And there it was, the question she had never allowed herself to fully ask, now spoken aloud, and it hung between them with a weight that could not be ignored. Daniel followed her gaze, looking at the child sleeping peacefully, and for a moment, something softened in his expression, something that had nothing to do with business or control, something human, unguarded. "The timeline matches," he said carefully, not rushing, not forcing the conclusion. "Everything points to the same moment, the same night." And he paused, letting that settle before continuing. "Whatever happened then, it changed both of our lives." And Emily felt that again, that quiet pull beneath her thoughts, stronger now, less fleeting, like something just beneath the surface trying to rise, and she pressed her fingers lightly against her temple, not in pain, but in concentration, as if willing something to return. A flicker came, sharper than before, a blurred image of bright lights, voices overlapping, a sense of urgency she could not fully grasp, and her breath caught slightly, her hand lowering as her eyes opened again, searching, trying to hold on to it before it slipped away, but it faded, leaving only the echo of something real, something close. "I saw something," she said quietly, almost surprised by her own words, and Daniel's attention sharpened immediately, not pushing, not pressing, but present, attentive, like he understood that this moment mattered. "What did you see?" he asked, his tone softer now, and Emily shook her head slightly, frustration and curiosity blending together. "Not clearly," she admitted. "Just light. Voices, like I was there but not fully aware." And she looked at him again, her gaze steady. But it felt real. And that was enough for both of them to understand that this was not imagination, not coincidence, but the beginning of something returning. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, because what she had just described aligned too closely with what he had read, with what he himself had experienced, that fractured moment he had never been able to fully recall, and now, standing here, the distance between their memories felt smaller, not gone, but narrowing. "Then it is still there," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, but she heard it, and something about those words settled differently than everything else, because they did not suggest loss, they suggested presence, something that had not disappeared, only hidden. Emily looked down at her son again, her hand resting gently on the edge of the bed, and for the first time, She did not see just the life she had built after everything was gone, she saw the possibility that this life had roots she had never understood, connections she had never questioned, and as she stood there, the document still in her hand, the man in front of her no longer just a stranger, she realized that the past was not something behind her anymore, it was something waiting directly ahead, and neither of them was going to turn away from it now. The air in the room felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, but sharper, like every word carried more weight than before, and Emily remained standing beside the bed, her hand resting near her son's shoulder, grounding herself in something steady while everything else continued to shift beneath the surface, and she looked at Daniel again, not as someone who had simply helped her, but as someone tied to a part of her life she had never been able to reach. "If it is still there," she said slowly, her voice measured, "then why has it never come back until now?" And the question was not just for him, it was for herself, for the years she had lived without asking, without pushing, accepting the silence where answers should have been. Daniel considered her for a moment, his expression thoughtful, not distant, but focused in a way that suggested he understood the complexity of what she was asking, because this was no longer about records or timelines, it was about something deeper, something neither of them had control over. "Maybe it needed a reason," he replied quietly. "Something strong enough to bring it forward." And Emily absorbed that, her gaze shifting briefly to the document still in her hand, then back to him, because if that was true, then this moment, this conversation, was not random, it was the trigger, the point where everything began to return whether she was ready or not. A soft sound came from the bed, and both of them turned instinctively, Emily moving closer as her son stirred, his eyes opening slowly, blinking against the light, confusion passing across his small face before recognition settled in. "Mom!" he murmured, his voice still weak but clear, and Emily's expression softened instantly, everything else fading as she leaned down, brushing her hand gently against his cheek. "I am right here," she whispered, her tone warm, steady, and for a moment, nothing else existed, not the document, not the unanswered questions, only the quiet reassurance between them. Daniel watched from where he stood, something shifting again in his expression, something that did not belong to logic or investigation, but to understanding, because whatever truth connected them, it had led to this, to a life that existed beyond explanation, beyond memory, and he could not ignore that. The boy's eyes drifted toward him then, curious but calm, and for a brief second, something passed between them, not recognition, not exactly, but a quiet awareness, as if the child sensed something familiar even if he could not name it, and Daniel felt it too, subtle but undeniable, a connection that did not rely on memory to exist. Emily noticed the exchange, brief as it was, and something inside her tightened, not in fear, but in realization, because the distance between past and present was no longer theoretical, it was visible, right in front of her, in the way her son looked at him, in the way Daniel did not look away. She straightened slowly, her hand still resting on the bed, and turned back toward him, her expression more certain now, more resolved. "You think I was there for you?" she said, not as a question, but as a statement she was testing against what she felt, and Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I know you were," he replied, his voice steady, grounded in everything he had seen, everything he had pieced together, and for a moment, the room felt quiet again, but it was not uncertain anymore, it was defined, shaped by a truth that had already begun to take form. Emily looked down once more at the document, then back at her son, then finally at Daniel, and in that sequence, something settled inside her, not complete understanding, but acceptance of the path ahead, because whatever had been lost, whatever had been hidden, was no longer something she could ignore, and more importantly, it was no longer something she had to face alone. "Then we find out what happened," she said, her voice calm but firm, and there was no hesitation in it now, no uncertainty, only determination, and Daniel nodded once, a quiet agreement that carried more weight than any promise, because for both of them, this was no longer about the past as something distant, it was about uncovering something that still mattered in the present, something that had shaped who they were without their knowledge. Outside the window, the light continued to shift, the day moving forward as it always did, but inside that room, time felt different, slower, more deliberate, as if it was allowing them the space to step into something they had not chosen but could no longer avoid. And as Emily stood there, her hand resting on the edge of the bed, the document no longer just paper but a beginning, she understood something she had never allowed herself to believe before, that forgetting did not mean something was gone, it only meant it was waiting, and now, finally, it was ready to be found. The decision did not feel loud or dramatic, it settled quietly between them, like something that had always been inevitable, and Emily remained where she stood, her hand still resting near her son, her posture steady but her thoughts moving with a clarity she had not known before, because for the first time, she was not reacting to confusion, she was moving toward understanding, and that shift changed everything. Daniel stepped closer to the small table beside the bed, reaching into his coat with deliberate calm before placing another document beside the one she already held, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a quiet intention that made the moment feel heavier than any words could, and Emily's gaze followed the movement immediately, her attention narrowing as she looked down at what he had brought. "There is more," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made her chest tighten slightly, not in fear, but in anticipation, because she understood now that each piece he revealed was not random, it was part of something larger, something that was finally coming into focus. She reached for the new document slowly, her fingers brushing against the paper as if testing its reality before lifting it, and when she unfolded it, the first thing she saw was the hospital letterhead, older, slightly different from the one in her hand, but unmistakably real, and her eyes moved quickly across the lines until they stopped, frozen on a section that did not just describe, it confirmed. Blood transfusion record. Her breath caught, the words settling deeper than anything else she had read, and she scanned the details beneath it, her heart beginning to beat faster as each line added something new, something undeniable, until she reached the part that made everything else fall into place. Donor, Emily Carter. Recipient, Daniel Hayes. For a moment, she did not move, did not speak, because the connection was no longer implied, it was written, documented, impossible to dismiss, and the room seemed to hold its breath with her as the realization unfolded fully, not as a possibility, but as truth. She looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his, and there was something different in her expression now, not just confusion or curiosity, but recognition, not of memory, but of meaning, of the role she had played in a moment she could not remember but could now understand. "I helped you," she said quietly, the words forming with care, as if saying them aloud made them more real, and Daniel nodded once, his gaze steady, not overwhelming her, not pushing further than she could go, but present, fully present in a way that made it clear he had already accepted this truth long before she had. "You did more than that," he replied, his voice softer now, the control still there but layered with something deeper, something human. "You stayed when no one else did, you made sure I was treated, and when it mattered most, you gave what I needed to survive." And Emily's grip on the paper tightened slightly, not from tension, but from the weight of understanding settling into place, because this was no longer about missing memory, it was about a choice she had made, a moment where she had acted without knowing what it would mean later. Her gaze drifted briefly to her son, then back to Daniel, and something inside her shifted again, stronger this time, more grounded, because if she had been capable of that, if she had been someone who stayed, who helped, who gave without hesitation, then the life she had lived since was not disconnected, it was a continuation, even if she had never realized it. "Why would I do that?" she asked softly, not doubting the truth, but trying to understand the reason behind it, and Daniel paused for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer was not simple, it was something that reached beyond records and timelines into something more personal. "That is what we still need to find out," he said, his tone steady, but there was something beneath it now, something unresolved, because even with everything he had uncovered, there was still a part of that night that remained unclear, something that had not been written down, something only she might hold, even if she could not access it yet. Emily nodded slowly, the question still lingering but no longer overwhelming, because she understood now that this was not something that would be answered all at once, it would come piece by piece, just like everything else, and she lowered the document slightly, her posture straightening, her expression calmer, more certain than it had been before. "Then we keep going," she said, her voice quiet but firm, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, only a clear decision to face whatever came next, and Daniel held her gaze for a moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, because this was no longer just his search or her confusion, it was something shared, something they would uncover together whether they were ready for it or not. The room remained still, the soft sounds of the hospital continuing around them, but something had changed in a way that could not be undone, because the truth was no longer hidden behind missing pieces, it was visible, written, undeniable, and as Emily stood there holding the proof of what she had done, of who she had been, she realized something that shifted everything, that even without memory, the person she had been was still there, not lost, not gone, but waiting to be recognized, and now, finally, she was beginning to see her. The room felt quieter than it had at any point before, not because the sounds had disappeared but because everything that mattered had already been said, and Emily stood still for a long moment, the documents resting in her hands, no longer foreign, no longer distant, but part of something that now belonged to her whether she remembered it or not, and she looked down at them one last time before gently placing them back on the table, as if acknowledging that they were no longer just evidence. They were a beginning. Her gaze moved to her son, who had drifted back into a peaceful sleep, his small hand loosely curled against the blanket, and she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against it, grounding herself in the life she knew, the life she had built without understanding where it truly began, and for the first time, she did not feel like something was missing, she felt like something had finally been found. Daniel remained where he stood, not speaking, not interrupting the quiet that had settled between them, because he understood now that this moment was not about answers, it was about acceptance, about allowing the truth to exist without forcing it into something immediate, and as he watched her, he realized that whatever had connected them 5 years ago had not disappeared, it had simply changed form, waiting for the moment when it could be seen again. Emily straightened slowly, her posture calm, steady, and when she turned to face him, there was no hesitation left in her expression, no uncertainty, only clarity, the kind that does not come from memory but from understanding. "I may not remember that night," she said quietly, her voice soft but unwavering, "but I know who I am now." And the words settled in the space between them with a quiet strength, because they did not deny the past, they embraced it in a different way, not as something she needed to recover completely, but as something that had already shaped her into who she was. Daniel nodded slightly, something shifting in his expression, not relief, not satisfaction, but respect, because he had spent years searching for answers, believing that understanding required full clarity, full memory, but now he saw that sometimes truth did not need to be remembered to be real, it only needed to be recognized. "And that has not changed," he replied, his voice low, steady, and there was no expectation in it, no demand for what came next, only acknowledgement of what already was. Emily glanced once more at her son, then back at him, and for a brief second, that same faint feeling returned, that quiet sense of familiarity that did not need explanation, and this time, she did not question it, she simply allowed it to exist, because she understood now that not everything needed to be fully remembered to be meaningful. "Maybe I do not need everything back," she said after a moment, her tone thoughtful but certain. "Maybe what matters is that I did not walk away, that I would not walk away again." And Daniel held her gaze, the words settling deeper than anything else she had said, because they spoke not just of the past, but of the present, of the choice she continued to make without hesitation. Outside the window, the light had shifted again, softer now, warmer, casting a quiet glow across the room that made everything feel less distant, less uncertain, and as Emily stood there, she realized that the past was no longer something she needed to chase, it was something that had already found its way back to her, not through memory, but through truth, through the undeniable connection between who she had been and who she had become. Daniel took a small step back, not as a retreat, but as a recognition that this moment belonged to her, to the life she had built, to the understanding she had reached on her own terms, and for the first time since this began, he did not feel the need to uncover anything further in that instant, because what mattered most was already clear. Emily turned back to her son, adjusting the blanket gently, her movements calm, certain, and as she did, a quiet realization settled fully into place, one that did not require memory to validate it, one that did not depend on missing pieces to feel complete. She had once stood in a moment where someone needed her, and she had stayed, she had given, she had chosen kindness without knowing what it would cost or what it would mean, and now, standing here, years later, she understood that nothing about that had changed, not really. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes steady, her presence grounded in something deeper than uncertainty, and the room felt still, not empty, but resolved, because sometimes the past does not return to be relived, it returns to remind you of who you have always been. He had searched for the truth in records and memories, but she had carried it all along in the quiet way she chose to care, and in the end, he did not just find the answer he was looking for, he found something far more lasting. He had the proof. But she had the heart.